The air in Mr. Albright's office was thick with the scent of old paper and lemon polish, a smell I'd always associated with finality. It clung to the heavy mahogany desk, the leather-bound books that lined the walls, and the funereal stillness of the room. My parents, Richard and Helen, sat opposite me, two rigid figures carved from the same block of disapproval I'd known my entire life. They had not spoken a word to me since I'd entered, offering only the kind of curt, dismissive nod one gives a stranger who has mistakenly taken an adjacent seat on a bus. 8 years of silence had passed between us, a chasm of their own making, and yet here we were, tethered together by death. My grandfather, Arthur, was the only thread that had ever truly connected us, and now that thread had been snipped. Mr. Albright, a kind man with watery eyes that seemed to hold a permanent state of gentle apology, cleared his throat. He adjusted his spectacles and unfolded the document on his desk. The last will and testament of Arthur Pembroke. My mother, Helen, smoothed the front of her tailored gray dress, a gesture of impatient propriety. My father, Richard, tapped a single, manicured finger on the arm of his chair, the rhythmic tick a tiny metronome marking the seconds of his wasted time. They expected this to be a formality, a swift and predictable transfer of assets from one respectable generation to the next. They saw my presence as a minor, legally mandated nuisance. The estranged daughter, the quiet disappointment, brought in for the reading before being sent back to her dusty, irrelevant life. As you know, Mr. Albright began, his voice soft but clear, Arthur was a man of very specific intentions. He was meticulous in his planning. My father's tapping stopped. He gave a slight, condescending smile. My father was a good man. Simple. But he knew the value of family legacy. Get on with it, Charles. The use of the lawyer's first name was a casual assertion of dominance, a reminder of the circles in which my father moved, circles I had never been invited into, nor had I ever wished to join. Mr. Albright's gaze flickered towards me for a fraction of a second, a small signal of, what? Reassurance. Warning. He took a breath and began to read. The legalese washed over me initially, a drone of clauses and subclauses. I heard the bequeathing of small sentimental items to distant cousins, a donation to the local bird sanctuary he'd loved so much, the instructions for his funeral, which we had already carried out. My parents sat poised and patient, waiting for the main event, the disposition of the Pembroke farm, 120 acres of rolling hills and timberland that had become, over the decades, prime real estate. The city had crept outwards, its hungry suburbs licking at the edges of my grandfather's property. To my father, that land wasn't a place of memory, it was a portfolio. It wasn't the soil my grandfather had tilled with his own hands, it was a multi-million-dollar development opportunity. And now, Mr. Albright said, pausing to take a sip of water, we come to the primary estate, including the farmhouse, all adjoining lands, and the entirety of the Pembroke financial holdings. My mother sat up straighter, if that were even possible. My father leaned forward, the mask of bored indifference finally slipping to reveal the avarice beneath. This was it. The culmination of their legacy. Mr. Albright looked down at the page. To my beloved and only son, Richard Pembroke, and his wife, Helen Pembroke, he read, and I saw the corners of my father's mouth twitch into a triumphant smirk. He shot a glance at me, a flicker of pity and derision. The poor, forgotten thing. The lawyer continued, his voice steady. I leave my sincere hope that you one day find a measure of peace that is not tied to material wealth. I leave you my forgiveness for the years of neglect, both of myself and of your daughter. And I leave you each the sum of $1 to be paid from the estate, as a token of what our relationship in the end was worth. Silence. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the compressed, violent silence that precedes an explosion. The air crackled. My father's face, a moment ago so smug, had drained of all color. He looked as if he'd been slapped. My mother's mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. Her perfectly manicured hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists in her lap. What is this?" my father stammered, his voice a choked whisper. "Is this a joke? Charles, what is the meaning of this? Mr. Albright did not look up from the document. He simply continued, his tone unchanged. As for the remainder of my estate, all property, real and personal, all financial accounts, stocks, bonds, and holdings, without exception, I leave it in its entirety to my granddaughter, Elara Vance. The name, my name, hung in the air like a held breath. I felt my parents' eyes pivot to me, not as a person, but as an obstacle, an absurdity, an impossible error in the universe. Their gazes were hot, acidic. I could feel the burn of their fury and disbelief on my skin. I did not look at them. I kept my eyes on a small, faded watercolor of a ship on the wall behind Mr. Albright's head, focusing on the tiny, painted waves until they blurred. Furthermore, the lawyer's voice cut through the tension. I name Elara Vance as the sole executor of this will, granting her full and unimpeded authority to carry out my final wishes. Her decisions in all matters pertaining to the estate are to be considered final and absolute. My father made a sound, a strangled gasp of outrage. This is preposterous. The old man was senile. He wasn't in his right mind. She manipulated him. He spat the word she, as if it were poison, pointing a trembling finger at me. For the first time, I turned my head and met his gaze. His eyes were wild with a fury I knew well, the same fury that had slammed doors and broken dishes and, 8 years ago, had severed me from this family entirely. My mother found her voice, sharp and brittle as shattered glass. Elara. You will not let this stand. You will do the right thing. This is a mistake and you will rectify it. Your father and I will oversee the estate, as your grandfather would have wanted, had he been lucid. It wasn't a request. It was a command. It was the tone she had used my entire life to correct my posture, my opinions, my very existence. They were not speaking to a 48-year-old woman. They were speaking to the timid, perpetually disappointing child they had always seen, the one they expected to fold under the slightest pressure. They looked at me and saw a rubber stamp, a tool to correct this bizarre injustice. I didn't cry. For years, their disapproval had been a constant, low-grade ache in my soul. Their final, formal excision of me from their lives had been a sharp, clean wound. But this public stripping of their entitlement, their raw, naked greed laid bare under the fluorescent lights of a lawyer's office, it did not wound me. Something else was happening inside me. A slow, quiet hardening. A settling. I looked from my mother's demanding face to my father's apoplectic one. I saw them, truly saw them, for the first time without the filter of a daughter's longing. They were just two people, grasping and desperate, who had built their identities on a foundation of perceived superiority. A foundation my grandfather had just demolished with a few strokes of a pen. Mr. Albright closed the folder. The will is ironclad. It was signed 6 months ago, witnessed by 2 physicians and myself. Arthur was of perfectly sound mind and body. My father stood up so abruptly his chair scraped back against the floorboards. We will contest this. We will see you in court, he glared at me. You won't get a penny. My mother stood beside him, a united front of indignation. She directed her words to me, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. You have 8 years of your own life to thank for this, Elara. Your grandfather pitied you. But pity doesn't make you competent. You have no idea what you're doing. You'll be lost. I did not answer. I simply stood, my purse held in my hands. The silence was my reply. It was a language they had taught me, after all. The silence of an empty chair at Thanksgiving. The silence of unanswered phone calls. The silence of a life lived in the margins of their world. Now I was using it back. And for the first time, it felt not like a void but like a shield. I gave a small, polite nod to Mr. Albright. Thank you, Charles, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I used his first name deliberately. I turned and walked out of the room, not looking back. I could feel their stunned, hateful silence following me down the hall, a pressure against my back. But I did not falter. I walked out of the building and into the cool afternoon air, and I did not look back. The humiliation they had intended for me had somehow missed its mark. It had recoiled and struck them instead. And in the quiet car on the ride home, a single, clear thought rose above the turmoil. It's done. The past is finally, unequivocally, done. The drive back to my small apartment was a blur of traffic lights and gray pavement. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, my breathing even. There was no shaking, no surge of adrenaline, no hot tears threatening to spill. There was only a profound and unnerving stillness inside me, as if the storm that had just broken in that office had taken place on a distant shore. I parked in my designated spot, walked up the 2 flights of stairs, and let myself into my quiet, orderly home. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. My apartment was my sanctuary, a space curated over years to be the antithesis of my parents' house. Where their home was a museum of expensive, untouched furniture and brittle status symbols, mine was filled with books, plants, and the comfortable clutter of a life being lived. A half-finished weaving sat on its loom in the corner. A stack of library books teetered on the coffee table. The air smelled of potting soil and old paper, the same scents as my grandfather's house, I realized with a sudden pang. I set my purse on the small entryway table and stood in the center of my living room. The silence I had wielded as a shield in the lawyer's office now settled around me like a blanket. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the echoes of the last hour. My mother's brittle command, "You will rectify this." My father's sputtering threat, "You won't get a penny." Their faces twisted with a rage that was born not of grief for the men they'd lost, but of fury at the wealth they'd been denied. And in that moment, the quiet decision I had felt forming on the walk out of the building solidified. It wasn't a conscious choice, not a debate of pros and cons. It was a settling of tectonic plates within my soul, a slow, grinding shift that locked a new landscape into place. I would not rectify it. I would not give in. I would not negotiate, placate, or capitulate. I would execute my grandfather's will down to the last letter, the last comma. Not out of spite, not for the money, but because it was the last thing he had ever asked of me. And because in doing so, I would finally, fully, honor the person he had always known me to be. My gaze fell upon a framed photograph on the bookshelf. It was of me and Grandpa Arthur, taken about 10 years ago. I was kneeling in his vast garden, soil smudged on my cheek, holding up a ridiculously oversized zucchini with a proud grin. He stood behind me, one hand on my shoulder, his face weathered into a map of gentle creases, his eyes bright with a mixture of amusement and deep, unconditional affection. That was the man they called senile. The man who taught me the Latin names of every bird that visited his feeder, who showed me how to read the rings of a fallen tree, who listened for hours as I spoke of my quiet passions for obscure historical texts and ancient weaving techniques, the very things my parents dismissed as unambitious hobbies. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Christmas, 8 years ago. The last family gathering I ever attended. It was at my parents' house, a sterile, catered affair where the conversation was as stiff and flavorless as the hors d'oeuvres. My father had been holding court, boasting about my younger brother, David's, latest promotion at his investment firm. David had been their star, the son who reflected their values back at them with dazzling brilliance. He'd had the corner office, the European car, the perfect wife. He'd also had a crippling addiction and a hollowed-out soul, things they refused to see until it was too late, but that's a different story. At that dinner, he was still the golden child. And Alara, my Uncle Robert had asked, turning to me with well-meaning condescension, "What are you up to these days?" "Still playing with old books at that library." Before I could answer, my mother chimed in, her voice light and falsely sweet. "Ilara is our scholar. She's content in her own little world." The subtext was clear, she's a failure. She has achieved nothing of note. Please, let's move on. I remember the heat rising in my cheeks. I was 40 years old, the head archivist for the city's historical society, a job I loved, and was deeply respected for in my field. But in their world, if it didn't come with a seven-figure bonus and a feature in a business magazine, it was tantamount to playing in a sandbox. "I'm preserving our city's history," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "It's important work." My father laughed. Not a kind laugh. It was a short, sharp bark of derision. "Important? Ilara, it's a filing job. Let's be honest. It's a respectable hobby, but it's not a career." And then, the final cut. A guest, a business associate of my father's, asked me what I had studied in college. I told him, medieval history and paleography. My father sighed dramatically. "Don't get her started. We spent a fortune on that education so she could learn to read dead languages. The return on investment has been negligible." He said it to the table, to his friends, as if I weren't even there. An anecdote. A joke at my expense. A write-off. And I saw it then, the chasm between us, not as a gap that could be bridged with effort and love, but as a permanent geological feature. We lived on different continents. In that moment, something inside me broke. I stood up, my napkin falling to the floor. "I'm finished," I said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the polite chatter. My mother's eyes widened in alarm, not at my pain, but at my breach of etiquette. "Ilara, sit down. You're making a scene." "No," I said, looking directly at my father. "I'm finished with this. With being your footnote. Your disappointment." I walked out. No one followed me. My phone rang twice on the drive home. It was my mother. I didn't answer. The next day, a package arrived by courier. It contained a few childhood keepsakes and a short, typed letter from my father. It stated that my disruptive and disrespectful behavior had made it clear that I no longer wished to be part of the family, and that they were formally honoring that wish. They were cutting me off. For my own good, of course. To give me the space I so clearly craved. It was a final, passive-aggressive act of erasure. I never heard from them again. Until today. Standing in my sunlit apartment, that memory felt less like a trauma, and more like a diagnosis. It was the moment the disease was named. My parents were incapable of seeing value outside of their own narrow metrics. They didn't see me, my passions, or my life. They saw only a reflection of themselves, and when that reflection was not what they wanted, they simply turned away from the mirror. My grandfather, Arthur, had never turned away. After the cutoff, he was the one who called. "I heard what happened, Ellie," he'd said, his voice rumbling with a gentle sadness. "Your father is a proud, foolish man. Don't let his small world shrink yours," and he hadn't. He visited me at my apartment. He came to the Historical Society, and let me show him the 18th century maps I was restoring. He'd looked at the delicate, browning paper with genuine reverence. "You're saving ghosts, Ellie," he'd whispered. "You're keeping their stories alive." He saw the importance. He saw me. This will, it wasn't an act of pity, as my mother had sneered. It was an act of profound, unwavering validation. It was his final story, the one he had entrusted to me, his archivist, to preserve and protect. He was saving me from them, one last time. He was giving me the one thing they had always held over me, power. Not the loud, domineering power they understood, but a quiet, unassailable authority. I walked over to my desk and pulled out a fresh legal pad and a pen. The first step was to probate the will. I would call Mr. Albright in the morning to begin the process. Then, I would need to get the farm appraised. I would need to go through my grandfather's belongings, a task that felt both monumental and sacred. I would need to be methodical. Organized. I would need to be the archivist he knew I was. As I began to write a list, the phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I knew, with absolute certainty, who it was. My parents, having commandeered someone else's phone to bypass my block. The ringing was shrill, insistent, a demand for entry into my quiet world. I watched the phone, my hand hovering over it. The old Alara, the child who still craved a crumb of their approval, would have answered, her stomach in knots, ready to be berated, ready to try and explain to make peace. But she wasn't here anymore. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I turned the phone over, silencing its frantic pulse. And I continued my list, my handwriting calm and clear. The work had begun. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet, procedural rhythm. I took a leave of absence from my job at the Historical Society, a conversation that was far easier than I'd anticipated. My director, a woman who valued methodical work above all else, simply nodded. "Take the time you need, Alara. We'll be here when you get back." My colleague, Ben, a young PhD candidate with a shock of unruly hair and an infectious passion for primary source documents, gave me a clumsy, one-armed hug. "Anything you need, just text." Seriously. If you need someone to help you decipher 19th century cursive, or just lift heavy boxes, I'm your guy. His simple, unconditional offer of support was a bomb. My first task was to visit the farm. I hadn't been there in nearly a decade, avoiding it because it felt too close to my parents' orbit, too tangled in the web of family obligations. But now it was mine. The thought was so immense it felt abstract. I drove the 40 minutes out of the city, watching the landscape soften from concrete and glass to green fields and sprawling oak trees. When I turned onto the long gravel driveway that led to the farmhouse, a wave of memory, so potent it was almost dizzying, washed over me. The house stood on a small rise, a simple, white two-story structure with a wide front porch, exactly as I remembered. It looked smaller than it had in my childhood memories, but also more solid, more real. The paint was peeling in a few places, and the garden my grandfather had so meticulously tended was overgrown with a riot of weeds and wildflowers, but it was still beautiful. It was a place that had been loved. I used the key Mr. Albright had given me. The lock was stiff and the door groaned open into a world preserved in amber. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of wood smoke, old books, and dried lavender. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating the worn floorboards and the comfortable, unpretentious furniture. Nothing had changed. His favorite armchair was still angled towards the window overlooking the bird feeder. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay on the side table, his reading glasses resting on top of it. It was as if he had just stepped out for a walk. I spent that first day just wandering from room to room, touching things. The smooth, cool surface of the stone fireplace he built himself. The collection of oddly shaped river rocks on the windowsill. The spines of the books that crammed every shelf, history, poetry, botany, philosophy. It was the library of a curious and gentle mind. This was the legacy my parents had dismissed as simple, the life they'd pitted. They had no idea of the richness here, the depth. Their world of balance sheets and stock portfolios was a sterile desert compared to this. In his study, I found his desk, a beautiful old roll-top, immaculately organized. And there in the center was a thick leather-bound ledger. I opened it. Inside, in his neat, deliberate script, was everything. A complete inventory of the farm's assets. Contact information for his accountant and broker. A list of the charities he supported. And notes. Pages and pages of notes addressed to me. "Ellie, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the farm is yours. Do not let them bully you. Your father sees this land as a commodity. I see it as a trust. It has been in our family for 5 generations, not to be exploited, but to be cared for. It is a living thing. You understand that. You always have." He went on to detail his wishes. He wanted a large portion of the land, the old-growth forest at the back of the property, to be donated to a conservation trust, to be protected from development forever. He wanted the farmhouse and the immediate 10 acres to remain as they were, a sanctuary. The rest of the land, the open pastures, he left to my discretion. Sell it if you need to, Ellie. Or find a young farmer who will love it. Or keep it all. The choice is yours. You have a good heart and a wise soul. I trust you. Tears finally came, hot and silent. They weren't tears of grief, not entirely. They were tears of gratitude. He had not just left me his property, he had left me his trust. He had left me a roadmap, a shield, and a blessing. He had armed me for the battle he knew would come. The calls and emails from my parents began in earnest. They had my email from some old family list and had procured my unlisted home number through means I could only imagine were unpleasant. The first few were from my mother, laced with a cloying, manipulative sweetness. Elara, darling, we were all upset. Things were said in the heat of the moment. But we are still your parents. We love you. We just want to help you manage this incredible responsibility. You mustn't try to do it all alone. When I didn't respond, the tone shifted. The next emails were from my father, blunt and demanding. Elara, you are legally and morally obligated to consult with us. This is a family asset. Your refusal to communicate is childish and irresponsible. I have retained legal counsel. You will hear from my lawyer shortly. I forwarded each message to Mr. Albright with a simple note, for your records. He had advised me to communicate with them only through him. Let me be the buffer, Elara, he'd said kindly. That's what I'm here for. So I didn't answer. I deleted the voicemails without listening to them. I set up a filter on my email account that sent anything from their known addresses directly to a separate folder. I refused to let their noise penetrate the quiet, purposeful space I was building around myself. My work was at the farm. My focus was on my grandfather's ledger. I called the conservation trust he had mentioned. The woman I spoke to, a passionate biologist named Dr. Anya Sharma, gasped when I described the property. The Pembroke Woods. We've been dreaming of getting that land protected for years. Arthur used to let us do bird counts there. It's one of the last remaining old-growth stands in the county. I scheduled a time for her and her team to walk the land with me. I hired an appraiser, a gruff, no-nonsense man named Henderson, to assess the value of the remaining acreage. He whistled when he saw the surveyor's maps. Lady, you're sitting on a gold mine. Developers would kill for this. You could build 500 houses here. I have no intention of doing that, I said calmly. He looked at me, his expression shifting from professional assessment to genuine curiosity. No? What are you going to do with it then? I'm still deciding, I told him. And it was the truth. Ben came out to the farm one Saturday, true to his word. He brought coffee and donuts and an infectious energy that cleared out some of the dustier emotional corners of the old house. He wasn't intimidated by the silence or the scale of the task. He was fascinated. I showed him Grandpa's study, the shelves of books, the ledger. His eyes lit up. This is incredible, Elara, he breathed, running a hand gently over a row of leather-bound histories. This isn't just a house, it's an archive. A personal archive of a life well lived. He had articulated the exact feeling I couldn't put into words. I was not dismantling a house, I was processing a collection. I was accessioning a life. The language of my profession gave me a framework, a calm, methodical way to approach the overwhelming emotion of it all. Together, we started sorting through boxes in the attic. We found photographs dating back to the 19th century, tintypes of stern-faced ancestors who had first worked this land. We found my grandmother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a cedar chest. We found my own childhood drawings, which Grandpa had saved, each one dated in his careful script on the back. As we worked, covered in dust and lost in time, Ben asked, "Are you hearing from them?" He didn't have to say who he meant. "They're trying," I said, carefully placing a stack of old letters into an acid-free box. Emails, calls. Threats of lawyers. Are you worried? I paused, considering the question. The old Elara would have been terrified. She would have been sick with anxiety, unable to eat or sleep. But as I stood there in the dusty attic, holding a piece of my family's history in my hands, I felt a surprising sense of calm. "No," I said, and the word felt true. "I'm not. I'm just busy. I have work to do." Ben smiled. "Good. That's the best way to be." The legal letter from my father's lawyer arrived a week later. It was aggressive and full of baseless accusations, undue influence, questions of my grandfather's competency, demands for a full accounting of the estate to be delivered to them immediately. It was a classic intimidation tactic. Mr. Albright responded with a calm, firm letter of his own, stating that as I was the sole executor, I was under no obligation to report to them, that all documentation of competency was on file, and that any further attempts at harassment would be dealt with accordingly. It was a polite, legal back-off. I knew it wouldn't stop them. It was only the opening salvo. But as I stood on the porch of my grandfather's house that evening, watching the sunset over the fields, I felt rooted. The house at my back, the land stretching out before me, it was all part of a legacy that had been passed down not just to me, but through me. My parents thought this was about money. They couldn't have been more wrong. This was about memory. It was about trust. It was about saving ghosts and keeping their stories alive. And that was a job for which I had been training my entire life. The next few weeks were a systematic process of untangling and reweaving. Each day, I drove to the farm, my car a small shuttle between my quiet city life and the sprawling, silent history of my grandfather's world. I moved through the tasks I'd set for myself with the focused precision of an archivist cataloging a new collection. This was my work now, and I found a deep, grounding satisfaction in it. I met with Dr. Sharma and her team from the Conservation Trust. We walked the 80 acres of old-growth forest my grandfather had so loved. It was like stepping into a cathedral. The sunlight filtered down through a canopy of ancient oaks and hickories, dappling the forest floor. Dr. Sharma pointed out rare wildflowers and the nesting sites of migratory birds. Her passion was palpable, and her gratitude, when I signed the preliminary donation paperwork, was overwhelming. "You have no idea what this means, Alara," she said, her eyes shining. "This land will now be protected in perpetuity. Arthur's legacy will be a living, breathing forest standing there, under the silent watch of those ancient trees." I felt the rightness of the decision deep in my bones. This was not a loss of value, it was the transformation of it. Next came the remaining pasture land. I had Henderson's appraisal in my files, a number with a staggering number of zeros. I could have sold it to the highest bidder, a developer who would have scraped it clean, and covered it with identical houses on treeless lots. I could have been wealthy beyond my wildest dreams. The thought held no appeal. It felt like a betrayal. Instead, I followed another of my grandfather's notes in his ledger. He had mentioned a local organization that helped young, first-generation farmers get access to affordable land. I contacted them. I met with a young couple, Maria and Leo, whose dream was to start a small, organic vegetable farm. They had the passion and the knowledge, but had been consistently priced out of the market by large agricultural corporations and suburban developers. We sat on the front porch of the farmhouse, drinking lemonade. They spoke of crop rotation, of building healthy soil, of selling their produce at local farmers' markets. They didn't see the land as a commodity, they saw it as a partner. They reminded me of a younger version of my grandfather. At the end of our conversation, I made them an offer, a long-term lease on the 30 acres of pasture land for a fraction of the market rate. Enough to cover the taxes and upkeep and nothing more. Their stunned silence was more eloquent than any words. Maria's eyes filled with tears. Leo just kept shaking his head, whispering, "I don't understand. People don't do this." My grandfather would have wanted his land to be loved and used, not just sold, I said simply. He would have liked you. In that moment, I understood power in a way my parents never could. Their power was about acquisition, control, dominance. It was a finite resource to be hoarded. The power my grandfather had given me was different. It was generative. It was the power to create opportunity, to protect beauty, to foster growth. It wasn't about holding on, it was about giving wisely. Meanwhile, the siege from my parents continued, escalating in its desperation. They had apparently realized that legal threats through lawyers were slow and ineffective. So they began a campaign of personal harassment. They showed up at my apartment building, buzzing my intercom repeatedly until I disconnected it. They left long, rambling messages with my building's superintendent, who thankfully just rolled his eyes and threw them away. Then, they came to my workplace. I had gone in for a day to consult on a project and help Ben with a particularly tricky manuscript. I was in the quiet, climate-controlled reading room, surrounded by the comforting silence of history, when the front desk librarian buzzed me. "Ilara. There's a man and a woman here to see you. A Richard and Helen Vance. They say it's a family emergency." My blood ran cold. The bubble of peace I had so carefully constructed was about to be breached. "I'll be right out," I said, my voice steady. Ben looked at me, his brow furrowed with concern. "You okay?" "It's them," I said. "Just stay here." I walked out to the main lobby. And there they were, standing by the circulation desk like two vultures. They looked out of place in the gentle, scholarly atmosphere of the library, too sharp, too loud, too angry. My mother was wearing a severe black suit, my father a crisp pinstripe. They looked like they were dressed for a hostile takeover. My mother rushed towards me as I approached. "Ilara. Thank God. We've been so worried. You haven't been answering our calls." Her voice was pitched to carry, to attract the attention of the handful of patrons browsing the shelves. It was a performance. The concerned parents cornering their wayward daughter. "There is no emergency," I said, my voice low and even. "This is my workplace. You need to leave." "Don't be ridiculous," my father snapped, stepping forward. "We need to talk. Now. About the will. About your complete and utter incompetence in handling it." "My handling of the estate is not up for discussion," I said, acutely aware of the librarian watching us with wide eyes. "I'm asking you again to leave. If you don't, I will have security escort you out." My mother gasped, placing a hand over her heart in a gesture of theatrical woundedness. "Security? You would call security on your own mother. You ceased to be my mother in any meaningful way 8 years ago," I said. The words were cold and hard, and they landed with satisfying precision. I saw the shock register on her face before it was replaced by a flush of anger. "How dare you?" she hissed. "We have just found out," my father's voice was a low growl of fury, "that you are giving away the land. Giving it away to some tree-hugging charity and a pair of dirt-digging hippies. Are you insane? That land is worth millions. It is our legacy." "It is my legacy," I corrected him, and the strength in my own voice surprised me. "It was left to me. And I am honoring the man who left it to me." "Something you seem incapable of understanding. He was a senile old fool who you poisoned against us," my father shouted. The librarian flinched. A student at a nearby table looked up from his textbook. This was their strategy, public humiliation. The same one they'd used for years. To make me feel small, incompetent, and ashamed, hoping I would crumble just to make the scene stop. But something was different now. I wasn't a guest at their dinner party. This was my territory. I was surrounded by the evidence of my life's work, a place where I was respected and competent. Their power had no purchase here. I looked past them and met the librarian's gaze. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She picked up the phone. "You've made your position clear," I said to my parents, turning my back on them. "And I have made mine. We have nothing further to discuss." I walked back towards the reading room, my steps measured and calm. I did not run. I did not look back. I could hear my father sputtering in rage, my mother calling my name in a tone that was a nauseating blend of command and threat. 2 uniformed security guards appeared, their presence large and official. I heard their calm, deep voices, my father's indignant protests. And then, silence. I stepped back into the reading room, and closed the heavy oak door behind me, muffling the last echoes of the confrontation. Ben was standing there, looking horrified. "I am so sorry you had to see that," I said, my voice trembling slightly now that the danger had passed. He just shook his head. "Don't be sorry. I'm just, wow. You were amazing." He paused. "Are you sure you're okay?" I took a deep breath, the scent of old books and archival glue filling my lungs. I looked at the quiet, orderly room, at the history waiting patiently on the shelves. This was my world. A world of substance, of fact, of stories that mattered. They couldn't touch me here. "Yes," I said, a real smile touching my lips for the first time that day. "Yes, I am." The final confrontation, I knew, was still to come. But they had shown their hand. And I had discovered mine was stronger than I had ever imagined. The final confrontation came not with a bang, but with the crunch of tires on a gravel driveway. It was a week after the scene at the library. I was at the farm, spending the day cleaning out the last of my grandfather's closets, a task that was both sorrowful and cathartic. I had packed away his clothes to be donated, keeping only a single, worn flannel shirt that still smelled faintly of him. The house was beginning to feel less like a museum of his life, and more like the beginning of my own. Maria and Leo had started tilling a small section of the pasture, and the distant, rhythmic hum of their tractor was a comforting sound. I was on the front porch, drinking a glass of iced tea, when their car appeared. A sleek, black sedan, utterly alien in the rustic landscape. It rolled to a stop, and they both got out. They didn't look like they had at the library, armored in business suits and righteous indignation. They looked diminished. My father's expensive suit was rumpled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. My mother's face was pale, her usual immaculate composure frayed at the edges. They looked tired. They looked defeated. They approached the porch steps but did not climb them. They stood on the gravel below, forcing me to look down on them. A small, final attempt at controlling the dynamics of the encounter. It didn't work. I remained seated in my grandfather's old rocking chair, the glass of tea cool in my hand. I did not speak. I waited. "Ilara," it was my father who spoke first. His voice was hoarse. All the bluster and rage seemed to have been burned out of him, leaving only a dry, ashen residue. "We need to talk to you." "I believe I made it clear we have nothing to talk about," I replied, my tone neutral. "Please," my mother said. The word sounded foreign in her mouth. I had never heard her plead for anything in my life. "Just, listen. We've been to see our lawyer. He's told us we have no case. Contesting the will would be a waste of money. Your grandfather made sure of that." I said nothing. I just watched them. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn, and in the distance, a flock of crows called to each other as they settled in the trees. "We don't understand why you're doing this," my father continued, a note of genuine, pathetic bewilderment in his voice. "Punishing us. Giving away our family's birthright. What did we ever do to deserve this kind of hatred from you?" The question was so breathtaking in its lack of self-awareness that I almost laughed. What did we ever do? It was the cry of the willfully blind. For a moment, I was tempted to list it all. The lifetime of small dismissals, the constant belittling of my choices, the derision, the neglect, the final, cruel cutoff. I could have spent an hour recounting the 1,000 paper cuts they had inflicted over the years. But I knew with a sudden, weary clarity that it would be useless. They would not hear it. They would not understand it. Their world was built on a narrative in which they were the benevolent, long-suffering protagonists, and I was the ungrateful, difficult child. To pierce that narrative would be to shatter their entire sense of self, and they would fight it with every ounce of their being. So I chose a different path. This isn't about hatred, I said, my voice as calm as the evening air. And it isn't about punishing you. This is about honoring him. I gestured with my glass towards the house, the fields, the forest beyond. This was his life's work. This land, this home. And he entrusted it to me. Not to you. But why? My mother cried out, her voice cracking. Why would he cut us out? His own son. And that was the moment for the reveal. Not a weapon to wound them, but a truth to end the conversation, to close the book. It was something my grandfather had told me a few months before he died, a confession he made one afternoon as we sat on this very porch. Because he knew you, I said softly. He knew you better than you know yourselves. He told me about the second mortgage you took out on your house to invest in that failed tech startup. He told me about the credit card debt you've been hiding. He knew that if he left you this land, you wouldn't be its caretakers. You would be its liquidators. You would have sold it to the first developer with a checkbook, paid your debts, and the Pembroke legacy would have been paved over for a subdivision called the Pembroke Estates or some other hollow irony. He spent his life protecting this place, and his last act on this earth was to protect it from you. The silence that followed was absolute. I had not raised my voice. I had simply stated a fact. But it landed with the force of a physical blow. I watched the blood drain from their faces. They looked at each other, and in that shared glance, I saw the ugly, panicked truth of my words reflected in their eyes. There was no denial. There couldn't be. I had just revealed the secret shame that was festering beneath their carefully constructed facade of wealth and success. My grandfather hadn't just disinherited them. He had seen right through them. And now so did I. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. What was there to say? I had taken away their last weapon, their narrative of victimhood. They weren't the wronged parties. They were just desperate. And greedy. And small. It's done, I said, my voice gentle now. There was no need for anything else. The forest is preserved. The fields are leased. The house is safe. His wishes have been fulfilled. There is nothing left here for you. I stood up from the rocking chair and carried my empty glass inside, leaving them standing there in the twilight. I didn't watch them go. I didn't need to. I went to the kitchen, washed the glass, and placed it in the drying rack. I moved through the quiet, familiar rooms of my grandfather's, my house. A profound sense of peace settled over me, a quiet, clean emptiness where the ache of their disapproval used to be. The war was over. Not because I had won, but because I had simply refused to fight on their terms. I had chosen to build instead of destroy. I spent that night at the farm, sleeping in my grandfather's old room. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birdsong and the low rumble of Leo's tractor. I made a pot of coffee and took it out to the porch. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and new beginnings. I saw Maria in the field, bending to inspect a row of newly turned soil. She saw me and raised a hand in a simple, friendly wave. I waved back. This was my inheritance. Not the money in the bank or the value of the land. It was this. The quiet mornings. The sense of purpose. The community being built on a foundation of care instead of greed. The freedom from a lifelong burden of seeking approval from people incapable of giving it. Looking out over the land, I finally understood the full scope of my grandfather's gift. He hadn't just given me a farm. He had given me back to myself. He had cleared away the noise so I could finally hear my own voice. He had known all along that my quiet world wasn't small or a failure. It was just waiting for the right soil to grow in. For so long, I had defined myself by their rejection. I was the daughter who was cut off, the disappointment, the footnote. But sitting there on that porch, I felt a new identity settle into place. I am a keeper of stories. A protector of legacies. A woman living a life of quiet, deliberate purpose. A life that is, by my own measure, immeasurably rich. Perhaps you, too, have felt yourself defined by the judgment of others. Perhaps you have been made to feel that your quiet passions are insignificant, that your gentle world is too small. I am here to tell you it is not. The measure of a life is not in the noise it makes, but in the beauty it cultivates. Find your garden, your archive, your sanctuary. Tend to it with love. Protect it fiercely. For in the quiet spaces, in the work that is true to your own soul, you will find a strength and a peace that no one can ever take away from you.